I am Joanne Cohen, the Vice President of Philanthropic Services here at the Community Foundation, and it's our pleasure to host this conversation today that we titled after the pandemic, Early Indicators for Philanthropy's New Normal. We're excited to bring you some just released data and insights about giving post-pandemic and how philanthropy responded to these unprecedented challenges that COVID-19 created, and really what it might mean for the future. We are recording this call. We're going to ask that everyone please remain on mute during the presentation, and then we will open the floor for questions. If you have a question during the presentation, if you wouldn't mind just dropping it in the chat at the bottom of your screen, I will curate those and present them to our speaker. You also, I know everybody's been Zooming for a long time, but you may want to select just speaker view for the Zoom call so that you're going to be better able to see the slides that Peter has prepared for us. So our Community Foundation is one of the proud partners with the Community Foundation Public Awareness Initiative, which includes more than 130 community foundations in all 50 states working to educate the public about how we're improving our communities. We help lawmakers understand the vital role that community foundations play in their communities and whether they represent a big city, a small town, or a rural area. And the goal of the CFPIA is to ensure that community foundations continue to transform lives for decades to come. A part of that work includes working with the media to help gain information about community foundations and to cover topics around philanthropy, tax policy, and social change. We've been working with our speaker today and got introduced to him through his work with the CFPIA. It is my true pleasure to introduce all of you to Peter Penapento, who's the co-founder of Turn2 Communications, where he oversees the agency's work in support of the CFPIA initiative. He also provides ongoing support to a number of community foundations, including the New York Community Trust, the Greater Washington Community Foundation, and the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. Peter also works with philanthropic organizations like the Southeastern Council of Foundations and the Community Foundation Opportunity Network. He started his career as a journalist with more than a decade covering the nonprofit and foundation world at the Chronicle, where he managed online and social media. He is the co-author of Modern Media Relations for Nonprofits, Creating an Effective PR Strategy for Today's World, and is currently chairman of the Community Foundation of Howard County in Columbia, Maryland. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce all of you and welcome Peter.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And it's such a pleasure to have a chance to meet with all of you this morning. So thank you for giving me a little bit of time out of your busy days to talk a bit about what's happening in philanthropy right now. And Joanne noted that I come to this work after having worked at the Chronicle of Philanthropy for a number of years. And it was there that I embarked in and led a number of their data projects, including a project that was my baby there. It was called How America Gives. And it was an effort to assess charitable giving in every US community. And what we did was we came up with a really interesting methodology for looking at how people gave in different communities around the country, right down to the metro area and zip code in some cases, and be able to help nonprofits and foundations and others in those communities understand the level of giving in their community compared to other parts of the country. And that's led me down the journey of really being a student of data about giving in the United States, and has kind of informed a lot of how I approach my work, even talking about the work of community foundations and nonprofits in the media today. And what's really interesting about that is what it says about giving in Florida. Wondering if you all have a sense of how you stack up against donors in other parts of the country in terms of your levels of generosity. The most recent version of How America Gives finds that you stack up really well. One thing that they really do with the data now is compare different parts of the country against kind of a national giving ratio, and they kind of anything at 0 is kind of the middle, and in Florida's case, across all income bands, people are giving relative to their income and cost of living at a higher rate than their peers in most other parts of the country. So for folks in that lower income band, the 50 to 75,000, for instance, they're giving roughly 12.7% more per person or per household than their peers in other parts of the country. And you see that those numbers go up for some other income bands. And where the state ranks in that is in terms of the total amount given, Florida is number 4 in the country in terms of how much money is given to charity each year, which is really impressive. It ranks number 8 in terms of how much is given per person who itemizes giving on their taxes. And when compared to that national giving ratio, you're number 16, which means you're above average in that regard. And how does Northeast Florida stack up in that area? Well, you'll find that you actually even stack up better compared to your peers in Florida. When you compare your giving rate to the state giving rate, across the board, you're giving at a much higher rate than your peers across the state. And when you compare the Jacksonville, Florida metro area to other metro areas of your size across the country, you're giving at a rate that's 40 to 45% more than what is happening in other parts of the country. So you should really be feeling good about the culture of philanthropy and the spirit of giving that you have in your community. It's really impressive, and it's really a testament to the work that a lot of you are doing, that the community foundation's doing, that the nonprofits there are doing, but really what individual donors are bringing to the table each and every day. And that really continued through 2020 and the pandemic. One thing that we've been doing with the work we've been doing with the Public Awareness Initiative is really paying close attention to how different community foundations and different communities responded to the global pandemic and the economic shocks that were facing communities. And the amount of money that flowed through relief efforts there, and the work that the community foundations and the community foundation and others were doing to support local nonprofits really extended that culture of giving that you've built there over the years. So now that we've set the table for how your community gives, I think it's really helpful to take a step back and look at what's happening across the country, and seeing not only how what's happening there kind of connects with national giving trends, but also how those giving trends might be impacting your own giving decisions, and also what we might expect for the nonprofit community in Northeast Florida moving forward. And Joanne mentioned that we actually have some breaking news to report today. Yesterday was the release of the annual Giving USA survey or report, which is the annual official measure of giving to charities in the United States each year. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to catalog $471.4 billion in giving. So they typically release this data in June, and we conveniently timed this presentation to be a day right after that. And what Giving USA found is that Americans gave collectively $471.4 billion to charity last year. And that was an increase of about 4% compared with 2019. And, you might have been seeing the headlines about how much money has been given and how donors were stepping up last year, and think, well, that 3.8% figure doesn't really seem like that great of a number. But when you consider what was happening economically in our nation last year, the amount of unemployment, the amount of disruption that people were having to their household incomes, and you might start to see those numbers in a slightly different way. Charitable giving really does typically follow economic trends. So during recessions, such as the recession of 2008, charitable giving typically goes down. But last year, we saw giving go up at a pretty good rate, even though our gross domestic product declined by 3.5% last year. So that's highly abnormal. the fact that we saw giving gains in so many sectors last year is really kind of counterintuitive to how things typically go with economic cycles. And giving as a percentage of the gross domestic product in our country totaled 2.3% last year, which is actually the highest number that it's been since that number has really been tracked over the course of decades. For many years, it was a little bit under 2.0% of GDP. And in recent years, it started to tick up a little bit over 2.0%. So the fact that giving as a share of our overall economy is continuing to grow, even though it's a pretty small number compared to our overall economy, is a good sign for what's happening right now. And when you look at where that giving came from and where it went, we start to get an even bigger picture of what's happening. Individuals really account for the biggest chunk of giving, and we're going to talk mostly about that today. But Giving USA also gives us a window into what foundations doing, what corporations are doing, and how much money is being left by people in their wills to charities too. And we'll talk a lot about individual giving today, because this is really the area where there's the most detail, and it's really probably most relevant to all of you too. And individual giving last year actually didn't go up a whole lot compared to 2019. It was up about 1%, which again is really good when you think about the fact that we were facing such a big economic shock last year. But when you put that in context and think about the impact of just one donor, Mackenzie Scott, who many of you may have been seeing headlines about her giving. She is the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder, and she has really dedicated herself to giving large sums of money away to nonprofits across the country in a very thoughtful and deliberate approach. And last year, she gave away $6 billion on her own in no strings attached gifts to nonprofits. And folks were not soliciting her for money. She has hired a group of advisors to work with her to research nonprofits that kind of meet her goals and are working to address inequities in communities across the country. And she's been finding ways to identify what those organizations are and bestowing money to them. And just yesterday, in fact, she gave another $2.7 billion to another 286 nonprofits around the country. Some of those are nonprofits in Florida. They are colleges and universities, HBCUs. She gave a lot of money to support equity efforts in the arts and to support local communities in a lot of ways. And her approach to philanthropy is really getting a lot of notice and is really, I think, going to drive how a lot of donors think about their giving moving forward. But without her giving last year, individual giving in our nation was actually down close to 1%. So when you take Mackenzie Scott's $6 billion out of that overall giving total, giving by everyone else in the country actually went down a little bit last year. And when you take a look at the very largest gifts last year, there were 14 donors who gave gifts totaling $12.2 billion. So included in that is Mackenzie Scott, but that is a abnormally high number for the very, very top donors to give. So the very high ultra net worth givers were giving at a really big rate last year. And those 14 donors comprised of close to 4% of all giving in the United States last year. So there was a really kind of a top heavy year last year. But at the same time, we actually saw more donors giving last year than ever before. By one measure, the number of donors in the United States who made a charitable gift last year actually increased by 7.3%. So what we saw was this big surge in giving by the folks at the very, very highest income levels. But we also saw a much more democratic amount of giving throughout the rest of the country. A lot of people stepped up and gave what they could last year during this great time of need. And I think that's really encouraging. And some of that was spawned or spurred by the fact that Congress passed a temporary universal charitable deduction, which gave people who didn't itemize an opportunity to claim up to $600 in charitable donations on their taxes. So they got a bit of a tax benefit too. And that democratization of giving also played out in events like Giving Tuesday, which you may know is an effort to really inspire people to give on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving every year to support local charities as a way to kind of kick off the charitable giving season at the end of the year. And last year on Giving Tuesday, close to $2.5 billion was given to charity on just that one day. 13% of the adult population in the United States participated in Giving Tuesday. When you think about that, close to 1 in 8 or about 1 in 8 people in the country gave to charity on that one day last year. And that marked a close to 30% increase in what was given last year. So people were really motivated to give last year. They couldn't necessarily give in big amounts like the super wealthy could, but people really saw the need that existed, and they stepped up in new ways. And that provides a lot of opportunities to cultivate those donors, a lot of those new donors, and turn them into lifelong donors and get them more engaged in giving as a habit moving forward. So that's a really encouraging sign. And Giving Tuesday also collects data on charitable giving on a more broad scale. And its findings really kind of reinforce the point I was just making about kind of those super high level donors giving at a higher rate, but also the donors kind of at the lower end of the economic scale giving at a higher rate too. You'll see that what they label as supersized donors, those making gifts of $50,000 or more, gave at 11% more last year than they had in 2019. And those who were at the lower end of the scale, those were giving gifts up to $100, and $101 to $500 were giving at a higher rate. But unfortunately, kind of in the middle of that, there was a decline among donors who were giving in that kind of $500 to $50,000 range, which really makes up a lot of donors. So we were seeing a lot of giving at the top. We were seeing a lot of giving kind of among the rank and file donor, and largely because of economic factors, a lot of folks kind of in the middle class who weren't able to give at the same rate that they did in previous years. 2020 was also a massive year for giving through donor advised funds. And this is an area that we spend a lot of time working with at the Community Foundation Public Awareness Initiative. We did quite a bit of data collecting on this last year, and we found that donors who have donor advised funds at community foundations especially really stepped up last year. We did a survey earlier this year on just what that looked like, and we found that at a group of about 85 US community foundations, which includes all of the top 20 largest community foundations, donors gave $6.7 billion out of their funds to support charities, and most of that was giving in local communities. And that figure was up more than 40% over a year ago. So if you have a donor advised fund and you stepped up, congratulations, you really came forward and really helped support nonprofits and your neighbors in need in a really big way last year. And that's something that really mirrors national trends or long-term trends too. There have been some studies that look at donor advised fund grant making during recessions, and they find that donor advised fund donors tend to give at a higher rate and in a much more sustained way during economic downturns than donors who give through other forms. So donor advised funds really have become a great safety net and a great tool for making sure that when times are bad, there is that community nonprofits and those who are filling the needs in our communities are getting the support that they need. And to put those numbers into further context, we found that donors put about 6.17 million into their donor advised funds in 2019, and they gave out 6.71 billion the year later. So for every dollar that was put into a donor advised fund in 2019, $1.08 was actually given out in grants to charities. So people were really moving money quickly and really trying to make sure that they were supporting the nonprofits that they cared about last year. And we're curious to see if that trend continues in 2021 and beyond. And that didn't always, or didn't just necessarily happen at community foundations. Community foundation donors gave big, but so did donors who had donor advised funds in other types of vehicles. Fidelity Charitable, which is now the largest charity in the United States, believe it or not, and also is the largest donor advised fund holder in the United States, reported that their donors made close to or a little more than $9 billion in grants from their funds last year. They supported 170,000 charities across the country, and they were giving grants to nonprofits in a way where nonprofits could really decide how they wanted to use the money. They weren't putting restrictions on it. About 2/3 of the grant recommendations were basically money that donors gave to nonprofits and said, you know how to spend this best, you know what the needs are right now, go ahead and use this money as you see fit. And a lot of this, the giving that was happening through donor advised funds and really overall last year was driven by donors who had non-cash assets to distribute. The stock market did great last year. And even though people didn't have as much disposable income to give, especially at those lower levels, those who had the resources and were thinking about how they could wisely give, were making big gifts of non-cashed assets. This is a chart or a graph that shows how donors who were giving to donor advised funds at Fidelity Charitable were making gifts. And as you'll see, a lot of that money, a lot of those assets that were coming into donor advised funds were from people taking non-cash assets, in a lot of cases, their stock holdings and investment gains, and rolling them into charity. And that helped spur a lot of that high level giving last year too. And it actually poises a lot of organizations to have the assets to continue to give, and for those donors to continue to make grants this year and beyond. And not only were donors motivated by the fact that their stock returns were doing well, they were also motivated by the urgent need that existed last year. Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy pegs total giving globally for COVID-19 at about $20.2 billion. And about 35% of that funding supported BIPOC communities, which meant that donors were really finding ways to step up and serve underserved communities, which was a really big trend last year and really speaks to, I think, where giving is going this year and beyond. And then we also charted through our work at the local level that community foundations nationwide, separate from donor advised funds, channeled about $1.37 billion to COVID-19 relief. And this was really happening at community foundations across the country. So the great work that's happening in Northeast Florida was being mirrored in a lot of other communities across the country too. People were really motivated to give locally and to support their neighbors in need last year. And another thing that's really interesting about the numbers last year is where giving went. Religion continues to be the #1 cause that donors support. That number's been shrinking each year as over the past couple of decades, and continues to go down a bit as religious participation goes down. But it still remains the dominant cause that donors have been supporting and will continue to support. But the number that really stands out here is the giving to human services organizations. That $65.1 billion figure was really quite high last year. And it was, again, a big response to the incredible needs that existed last year. And giving to education was also notably higher last year, even though in the past, during times of recession, a lot of times education giving is one of the first things that goes down. And this chart kind of pegs where the growth really happened last year. You'll see that Giving Tuesday's data found that human services organizations saw an over 21% increase in giving last year. And I was actually wrong on that education figure. Sorry, that was actually down a little bit, but it was at a higher level than typically happens during recessions. We also saw a real decline in giving to arts and culture organizations, which is really troubling to a lot of those groups because they tended to be facing some real economic hardships last year. So there's going to be a real push this year, I think, especially among foundations, to try to support those organizations in a bigger way. Foundations, while individual giving was somewhat flat, foundations really stepped up their giving last year. They gave close to 1 in 5 in every dollar given to charity last year came through a foundation. That's the highest number in history. Foundation giving increased by 17% to about $88.5 billion last year. And beyond the numbers, what foundations were doing last year was really kind of moving away from some of the restrictions that they had placed on their grant making in the past. A lot of foundations typically give to specific projects, or they attach strings to some of their grant making to tell nonprofits, you can use this money to support this project or this initiative at your organization. In this case, a lot of foundations said, you know what, again, you're facing a time of great need and great change. We're going to give you more funding this year because we know you need it, and you're going to have the opportunity to decide where that money goes and how it's used. In a lot of other cases, foundations were accelerating payments. If they were making, if they had decided to grant a charity a grant over a period of 3 years, for example, they were saying, all right, we're going to give you all of your funding this year because, again, we know that the need is really great right now. So we're going to accelerate our giving to you with the hope that it will help you get through this tough time and support your community in a more thoughtful way. There was also, again, a real focus on trying to support efforts that promoted racial and economic equity. And we saw a lot of efforts by foundations to partner with other foundations, with government, with nonprofits, to mobilize funds quickly and find ways to address problems in a real collaborative way last year. And I think that's a trend that we're really going to see continue this year and moving forward. Really quickly on corporate giving, this was an area that really suffered in 2020, and we're expecting to see continue to be a challenge this year and moving forward. Corporate giving actually decreased last year by 7.3%. And it was about less than 1% of pre-tax profits, which is actually pretty much in line with what it's been in the past. So we who are following this, and a lot of others in the field, believe that corporate giving really suffered last year because a lot of companies and sectors suffered. So companies that had the resources continued to give, and in some cases stepped up. But because big portions of our economy were struggling, a lot of companies didn't have the resources to give last year as they had in previous years. And it really connected in a lot of cases where a lot of big companies that had the resources to give were actually giving in a bigger way. And a lot of smaller businesses just didn't have the give and the leeway to be able to do that. So what are we expecting moving forward? This is really, I think, going to be a pivotal year for giving, and a lot of new habits are going to emerge that are going to impact the way people give now, but probably give moving forward too. And I want to start with foundations because we talked about them most recently, but also because we have a bit of a window into that through the work that we do with my work. Last year, contributions were flat in terms of money that went into foundations overall, but investment returns increased. So even as foundations last year were giving at a higher level and giving more of their endowments at a higher percentage of their endowments last year in a lot of cases, they still saw their endowments grow in many cases. So they still have the resources to give at a stepped up level this year, or even if they do return to kind of that historic 5% threshold that a lot of foundations follow, 5% of their assets, there's more capacity for them because their endowments are going up to maybe give it a higher level to charity this year. But while a lot of them were stepping up and instead of maybe giving 5%, giving 6, 7, or 8% of their endowments last year, a lot of them are indicating they're probably going to move back to their more historic giving patterns this year. So they have more to give, but they're not necessarily going to be giving at a higher rate of their endowments like they had in 2020. And that'll probably be the case for many foundations moving forward. But we are hearing that a lot of foundations are removing the strings from their giving. They're not giving as many restricted grants for very specific things, and instead recognizing that the nonprofits that they give to really have the best read on how they can best use those assets to achieve their mission. So a lot of foundations are moving away from restricted giving and moving more towards unrestricted giving. And a lot of community foundations and private foundations are really doubling down on racial equity. We're seeing a lot of community foundations through the work we do, really going back to the drawing board with their strategies and saying that they're going to center a lot more of their investment and a lot of their community leadership efforts on trying to address economic and racial equity in their communities. And a lot of private foundations are making those same proclamations. And in terms of individual giving, for donors who have assets that are invested, even though they stepped up their giving last year, their investments grew in a very big way. So we expect to see donors seeing that their fund balances are continuing to grow, feeling as though they have more capacity to give if they have donor advised funds this year than they have in the past. So we're hoping that those increased investment assets, and this is just showing the investment asset growth at Fidelity Investments and their charitable gift fund. But as you'll see, fund balances really continue to grow through investment gains. And as the stock market is continuing to do well this year, that's giving donors the feeling that they have the opportunity to give more out of their accounts, and they still see the need existing in their community. So we're hoping that connects to more individual giving and more giving through donor advised funds this year. And in terms of what we're hearing in the communities that we're talking to and from nonprofits, that surge in giving to human services, that's likely to wane a bit this year because people aren't seeing the need to give to food and shelter and some of the more immediate needs that they gave to last year. We're seeing a lot of donors and Mackenzie Scott being kind of the ringleader on this and kind of the standard bearer on this, really supporting efforts that advance racial equity. We're also seeing that among companies this year, making a lot more of a commitment and a stated goal of giving to support equity. We see a lot of donors thinking that they may have stopped giving to their local or to their alma mater or to some other organizations that they felt didn't need the support that they typically give last year, and shifting back to those. So those arts groups, higher education, a lot of other organizations that may not have gotten as much support last year are hopefully going to recoup some of that this year as donors shift away from some of those immediate needs. And religious giving is going to continue to be challenged as fewer folks are affiliated with congregations. And one of the big X factors this year is what's happening on Capitol Hill. one good thing that has happened already is that the universal charitable deduction that I mentioned earlier has been extended through 2021. So that provides a benefit of up to $600 for joint filers to be able to claim charitable deductions on their tax returns, even if they're not itemizing their taxes. So that's a real incentive for those who may not be itemizing their taxes or may not feel as though they can extend their giving to be able to do a little bit more and give a little bit more this year. So that surge in giving we saw from folks giving at lower levels, I think tax policy anyway is actually trying to encourage that and make sure that donors have the opportunity to give more this year. President Biden has announced a tax plan that would increase the tax rate for those who earn more than $400,000 a year, and would increase the gains, the taxes on capital gains. And while it's still probably a ways away from this moving forward, given kind of the nature of things in Washington right now, if it does go through, it is seen as a potential benefit to charitable giving, because taxpayers in that upper tax bracket may try to offset some of what they would pay in taxes by directing more money to charity. And they may shift more of what they've accrued in investment gains to charity as well, as a way to lower their tax burden and have some control over how their money is being used. And we've also heard that this is a potential boon for nonprofits that offer plan giving opportunities. And those are opportunities for donors to give end of life gifts. There are mechanisms like charitable gift annuities that provide donors with a stream of income while they're living, and then the rest of the money gets turned over to charity when they pass on. And that tool could become very popular as a way for people to kind of manage their assets and investments and avoid some tax payments if the Biden tax plan becomes a reality. But more challenging for nonprofits is an effort that would restrict or attempt to speed up donor advised fund payouts. There was a proposal that was brought forth last week by Senator King in Maine and Senator Grassley in Iowa that would put a time limit on charitable when donors need to make grants out of their donor advised funds to qualify for tax incentives for that. And it also would put some other limits on donor advised fund giving that would potentially dissuade some donors from wanting to use those tools moving forward. And we believe that by putting kind of a limited threshold on what donors are recommended to give each year through donor advised funds, that there might actually not only be less giving into donor advised funds, but donors with, instead of trying to cycle money through their donor advised funds, within a few years, may decide that they want to do it over a longer time horizon. So that could ultimately hurt giving to nonprofits. We really believe that this is a solution in search of a problem. We find that, the payout rate from donor advised funds at community foundations tends to be about 20% per year, which means that in many cases, donors are giving out what they put into their funds within 5 years. And a lot of donors are putting new money in even as they're taking new money out and giving it to charity. So we're really concerned that some of these limits would really impact the work that community foundations are able to do, and ultimately impact the amount of money that might go out to charities each year. So we're watching that very closely. I know the Community Foundation is watching that very closely, and we'll be communicating more about that on ways that you can take action if there's a need to do that moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions, Joanne.
Great, thanks, Peter. If everyone wants to go ahead and unmute, that would be fine. We do have a question potentially / comment. Peter, with the CARES Act, it allowed those cash donations 100% deduction against the AGI.
Mhm.
And so one of our participants is wondering if you think what kind of an effect that might have had on the giving statistics this year.
That's a really good question, and I've been looking for an answer to that in anticipation of this. I haven't, unfortunately, there's been no study that has been able to say that this portion of giving last year was directly tied to that. Anecdotally, we're hearing that more donors are taking advantage of that, and that that it is made it easier for a lot of them to justify giving at a higher rate because they know they can recoup some of that back on their taxes. But right now, it's just conjecture. There hasn't been any real, any type of in-depth study on that yet. But it would stand to reason that if donors have a bigger incentive to give, that they will give more if they're aware of it.
Great. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have another question? This is, we're so appreciative, Peter, of the time that you took to really unpack the Giving USA data. I know we at the Community Foundation here look at that data on a regular basis, and just knowing how much of a lift that was between yesterday and today, I want to thank you for sharing all of that. Anything that anyone on the call would like to ask Peter, please go ahead and unmute yourself. We have a little bit more time for conversation, questions, things that you may have been observing in your own space or household.
Threw a lot of numbers at everyone.
Hi, Peter. This is John Zell. I'm on the staff at the foundation, and was wondering, in looking at past year's data before the individual deduction was increased substantially, we got a pretty good snapshot as to sort of the medium to small size donors. Is there any way to determine, going forward, short of the Giving Day information, the amount of giving that people who, give in that maybe $500 to $10,000 a year range who aren't itemizing, to determine it, are they still giving, or did the raising of the deduction, the standard deduction so high, really curtail their giving?
That's a really good question. It's really hard to aggregate those numbers without being able to, we were able to see what the IRS could report before, and now we really don't have that measure anymore. But, we do know that charitable giving has continued to go up, and charitable giving as a percentage of the gross domestic product has continued to go up. So, it would seem that if there has been a tail off in that giving, that it's been outweighed by what people on the higher end of the income scale have been able to give. But outside of some of what Giving Tuesday has been able to aggregate and what Giving USA is able to estimate, it's really hard to know for sure exactly what those giving levels are at now. What we were hearing a lot of last year, and it's been reported a lot in the Chronicle and elsewhere, is that kind of that mid-level donor has been a little harder to reach, especially during the pandemic. Folks who kind of give above the itemization threshold, but don't give at the levels of the wealthier donors. So I think there's some better data coming out on that, but it's a lot harder to get arms around what the smaller level donors are doing.
Peter, this is Cleve Warren. I'm really intrigued by Fidelity's growth in the space of being an aggregator of advised funds, if you will. And so I'd like your opinion about how they also represent themselves in communities in the way that the Northeast Florida Community Foundation does. It often speaks for itself in the community, particularly with respect to social responsibility issues, and not just to represent its donor population. How does Fidelity meet that same sort of community demand corporately?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And as somebody who lives and breathes community foundations, I mean, this is I'm a big believer that community foundations do a much better job of representing their donors and really kind of helping their donors connect with causes that matter to them at the community level in a much better way than a Fidelity can. Fidelity is an organization that does a really good job of investing the money and keeping their fees low and making it very easy for investors to kind of roll their money into donor advised funds and then get that money out to charity. But they don't take as active of a role in advising their donors on where to give and how to give, and that's just not how they're set up. So, community foundations are much more hands-on that. Their mission is locally focused. Donor advised funds are a part of what they do. They're not all of what they do, and they're really much more focused on working with the donor and helping them identify the organizations that really connect with what they want to accomplish as donors. Fidelity and some of the other big investment houses, I think, try to do that, but they don't have the boots on the ground in the same way, and they don't have the expert teams that the community foundations do. So does that answer the question?
It does, yes. Thank you for that.
And my apologies if anybody from Fidelity Investments is on the call. So.
Anybody else have a question? I know there's a lot to digest. There's a lot of things
Joanne?
happening. Yes, go
Joanne,
ahead.
hey, it's Rena.
Hi, Rena.
Hey, Peter, I'm wondering if in your research you've started asking philanthropies and foundations about how they evaluate who or what they give to, just because of the, a lot of publicity around Mackenzie Scott's process that's very data centered, and then it's hands off after that. I'm wondering if there's if that's part of the questions that you ask of folks.
We haven't done a whole lot of surveying on that, but we're in constant contact with a lot of foundations, and there's been a sense that foundations and a lot of foundations are believing this now, that they may have been a bit too hands-on in trying to quantify the impact of what they were giving to charities, and put a lot of requirements on charities to kind of report on how their money was being invested, which actually is a bit of a burden on the charity in some cases, to, especially if it's a small organization, to report that. So, what we're seeing is that a lot of foundations are recognizing that there might be an opportunity to give nonprofits a bit more leeway, with the idea that it might be a little harder for the foundation to assess impact, but that the nonprofits themselves will be able to devote more of their resources to using those investments in ways that they think that they're going to have a greater impact towards their missions. So there's it's streamlining grant applications and asking fewer questions, so nonprofits don't have to spend so much time applying for grants. It's removing some of the reporting on the back end, and or saying that, we're going to give you $50,000, but you have to use it for this project because that's what you applied for. I think there's a lot more of a moving away from that.
Thanks. Gary, you have a question?
Yeah, Peter, you had mentioned the $600 for the deduction for the non-itemizers being extended this year. In the CARES Act last year, they also allowed cash gifts directly given to the nonprofit to be 100% deductible against your AGI versus the normal 60%. Has that been extended as well?
I believe that the entire provision was extended this year. But consult with your
Your tax advisor.
Your
Okay.
tax advisor on that. That's not, I was a journalist, so I'm
Sure.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anything that the data kind of makes you go, huh? Or is there more information for any of you who have spent some time looking at the Giving USA report? You know that it is about 100 pages long, sometimes a little longer than that. And so it does take a while to, to distill it through.
Joanne, I did want to just share some statistics from us that match what Peter said for the Community Foundation for Northeast Florida. Gifts from non-endowed donor advised funds were 21.5% last year, so definitely up. And gifts into those funds, so donors contributing to their donor advised funds, was down about 24 million. And Gary, to your point earlier, part of that really was donors giving cash gifts directly to nonprofits, because that 100% deduction you could not give to your donor advised fund. That was excluded. And so we did see a decrease in gifts, new gifts to donor advised funds at the Community Foundation, but we know those dollars went out directly to nonprofits in the community, which is terrific as well. Had those dollars come into donor advised funds, our payout would have even exceeded 21.5%, but that's a high percentage. So we were pleased at the amount of grants that went out last year directly to nonprofits. So I just wanted to share a few statistics from us.
That's great context. Thank you for that, Nina. Then, yes, I forgot to mention that restriction on gifts into donor advised funds not qualifying for that. So that was a barrier for money going into the Community Foundation donor advised funds, but certainly still money was going out to charity.
Yeah, and if they extend that this year, it'll hurt the community foundations again.
Yeah, I mean, it is good though. Generally, we're pleased that that donors are still being actually more generous even last year than in years before. We know we have been able to track major gifts that have come directly from donors to nonprofits and have helped some of those gifts happen. So have helped connect donors to the nonprofits, but not coming through us, it's still going out into the community. So we're really pleased about that. It does affect our assets, certainly. But the whole idea for us is let's get the money in and get it back out.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Nina. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining us. Like I said initially, we are looking to have in-person Donors Forum gatherings starting again in the fall. We'll be sending communications to you regarding those topics and dates, so you can get those on your calendar. I want to thank Peter again for joining us. This was really informative and enlightening, and it's a good place to start to digest a lot of this data. If you have any questions, if there's anything we can help you guys with, please don't hesitate to reach out. You know where to find us. We're all back in the office and we're all working full steam ahead. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon and happy June. And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks for coming.